In 2016, the American Values Survey done by Public Religion Research Institute found that, quote, no issue in 2016 is viewed by more Americans as important today than terrorism, with 70% saying it is a critical issue to them personally. And back then in 2016, over 4 in 10 Americans, almost 50% of Americans, said immigration was an issue of critical importance. So Trump, over the course of his election campaign in 2015 and 16, really conflated the idea of terrorism and immigration in the minds of many, many, many voters across the country. Then they did a survey in 2020. They just released, I would say, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago. In 2020, PRI found that terrorism as a defining issue had had dropped to 45%, had gone from 70% in 2016 to 45% in 2020. What's important to voters now is the coronavirus pandemic at 60%. And then, kind of issues around the economy and jobs. So I think one reason why immigration has not been a kind of a driving factor for the campaign so far is because Trump, quite frankly, and politicians overall have not had the opportunity to conflate the kind of very visceral and emotional story that energizes many people. But I think there's a couple of things to keep in mind here. In 2018, I would argue that a significant number of suburban voters ended up parting ways with the Republican Party because of the child separation crisis along the border. So I think another reason why Trump has not been talking about immigration as much is that he realizes that in 2018 it was a losing issue for for voters. Now, in the last 48 hours, we've seen an uptick in conversation or rhetoric from the Trump campaign around immigration. Stephen Miller has done a few interviews over the last few days, speaking to continuing to cut legal immigration, continuing to slash the refugee admissions cap. So the Trump campaign is trying to kind of gin up people. Now, the Biden campaign on their end, they have, I would argue, kind of stayed away from the issue, other than kind of speaking to DACA or Dreamers, kind of very broad brush comments. But also in the last 48 hours, they've released a video speaking very specifically to the child separation crisis, and calling for and committing to a federal task force to reunite the 545 children that remain separated. But I think the more interesting and almost more important story that needs to be told is the role of immigrants and immigration in small town America. And that's either kind of rural parts of the country or suburban parts of the country. So, a place, there's a lot of talk these days about Texas, right? And this massive turnout in Texas is coming from voters, Latino and white voters in Texas. But as you probably know, in Texas, it's Fort Bend County in Texas, which is actually one of the most diverse counties in Texas, and has this massive Asian population and South Asian population. So telling those kinds of stories of how the Asian community and communities kind of beyond the Latino community are politically engaging, or contributing to the response and recovery to COVID-19, I think are really, really important stories to tell. I think as advocates, we have missed an opportunity to build the coalition of voters and policymakers who see immigration as a priority. And what I mean by that is, for us, for example, we do a lot of work with conservative and moderate faith, law enforcement, business leaders. And we just find that by bringing them into the conversation alongside the immigrant community, then a policymaker, whether it is somebody like potentially President Biden, or a Republican or Democrat in Congress, they realize that the need for constructive immigration reforms is not limited to demands coming from the immigrant community. The demands coming from the immigrant community are being echoed and supported by a broad spectrum of voters from Democratic to Independent to Republican. So I think if we do have an opportunity in the years ahead, we have to learn the lessons of the past and realize that the coalition that's necessary to pressure a Pelosi, a Biden, or a Schumer to actually move something forward and to spend the political capital necessary to move something forward requires that those of us on the outside build these much broader and inclusive coalitions that are, yes, still are being led by and defined by the immigrant community, the immigrant voice, but are bringing along the rest of the country. And we don't do ourselves a disservice by, kind of siloing our demands. Look, if it is a second term of a Trump administration, we will continue to see cuts to legal immigration. I mean, over the course of his time in office, we've seen a cut by over 50% since COVID. In essence, immigration has been almost completely closed. I think with a Trump second term, we'll see cuts to legal immigration. We will see continued attacks on DACA recipients. Those with temporary protected status will lose their status, and we'll see 400,000 individuals and their families being forced to return to their home country. So I think the list of things that a Trump administration will do to reduce immigration, take away whatever rights are left for immigrants, that's the reality that we'll face.
I'm going to talk about deaths in detention facilities, ICE detention facilities, some of the changes to the refugee and asylum system, some of the changes to foreign worker categories, with focus particularly on the H-1B visa, and then sort of end with what Trump has basically done to the legal immigration system, especially this year, which is essentially shut it down. So when it comes to deaths in detention, we've seen a sharp increase in the year 2020, the fiscal year, which ended at the end of September, of an increase of up to 21 people who have died in immigrant detention, which is up from 8 people over the 2019 fiscal year. And this is over a time, by the way, when the number of people admitted to ICE detention facilities is much lower than it was in earlier years. So, for instance, in 2019, 511,000 people were admitted to immigration detention. In 2020 fiscal year, it was only about 177,000. So you have a much smaller pool of people going into immigrant detention facilities, but a much larger number of people who are dying. So much so that the death rate in ICE immigration detention in 2020 was 11.8 per 100,000 admissions, which is almost 7 times higher than what it was in 2019, and the second highest that we have on record. The only other year that was slightly higher was in 2004, which is right when they started to actually keep statistics on the number of people who died in immigrant detention facilities. Now, the deaths in ICE detention facilities, on average per year, were highest during the George W. Bush administration. There were 91 total deaths, 2003 to 2008, for a rate of about 6.4 per 100,000. But deaths fell rapidly from 2004 onward. 2004 was just like a terrible year for people dying in immigration detention. So they started to improve dramatically after 2004. During the Obama administration, the death rate continued to fall to 2.3 per 100,000. And we've seen it go up under the Trump administration. It's 3.6 per 100,000. So we're seeing the number of deaths increase as a percentage of those who are admitted. And I want to say one of the main reasons the numbers have fallen this year is because the administration, beginning in March, started to rely on what's called Title 42, which is a legal category that allows them, in the case of a pandemic or public health emergency, to basically close the borders. Anybody apprehended is just turned back immediately um, uh, to where they came from, or just pushed over the border into Mexico, even if they came from another country, without any kind of due process, without anything like that. So the only reason why these admission numbers into the ICE detention facilities are as low as they are is because they're just expelling unlawful immigrants and other border crossers immediately without even giving them any due process or any chance to apply for asylum. So that's the reason why those numbers, part of the reason why they look as bad as they do. But no matter how you slice it, no matter how you dice it, the deaths in detention facilities are up. Now, when it comes to the refugee and asylum system, I have some pretty, of course, depressing news. And that is compared to 2016, the number of refugees admitted in 2019 were down about 85%. And the numbers this year are down even further. And next year, the administration has slated to reduce them. So when they were down from about 85,000 in 2016, last year they were about 11,000. And we suspect that it'll be even lower next year. And when they talk about these different refugee caps that they put in place, last year's there was 18,000. They let in about 11,000. They always under admit. So even if they say they're going to admit 15,000 or 12,000 or 10,000, you can guarantee the number that they actually will admit will be lower than that. So when they have these refugee caps, that's like the uppermost bound for this administration in terms of admissions. If we all remember well, the main justification for reducing asylum, ending these programs, was the national security fear. It was the fear that refugees, particularly Muslim refugees from the Syrian civil war or elsewhere, were a very serious terrorist threat to the United States. But if you take a look at the numbers, you take a look at the number of people killed on US soil from 1975 through the end of 2017 who were admitted as refugees, there were only 3 people killed in terrorist attacks committed by a refugee on US soil. And all of them were in the late 1970s. So that works out to an annual chance of being murdered in a refugee terrorist attack at about 1 in 3.8 billion per year. Very, small chance. It's not a consolation to the victims, of course, but it's a very small chance. And you compare that to the benefits of letting refugees in, and it just doesn't compare. To put that sort of in perspective, the annual chance of being murdered just in a normal homicide during that time period is about 1 in 20,000 per year. So it's just a vastly different comparison. Now, to asylum, I'm afraid it's even more depressing. The government has virtually shut down the asylum system on the southwest border and put in place numerous restrictions and legal loops that asylees have to jump through in order to get asylum, most spectacularly having to wait in Mexico through the MPP program for their court dates. So you have sort of this situation where there are essentially refugee camps on the US border in Mexico. Of course, all that is a huge sham that is intended to raise the costs and make it more difficult for people to gain asylum. Now, moving on to the foreign worker categories, what the administration has done here is that in response to COVID-19, the government has essentially shut down every guest worker visa program in the United States, with the exception of the H-2A program, which is for seasonal agricultural workers who are almost the vast majority are from Mexico. I believe it's over 95% are from Mexico. So those are the only types of workers who are really being admitted in now. This is enormously destructive to the U.S. economy. One example of this is, many of us are able to keep our jobs because we're working remotely. And we're able to do that because of IT services provided. We're able to have this Zoom call because of IT services, right? And if we didn't have these great services, it'd be much more difficult for us to work remotely. And what we've seen is that H-1B workers, the majority of whom work in computer occupations, many of them in IT services, have substantially lowered the price of supplying IT services to the US economy. And as a result, millions of Americans likely are able to keep working because we have access to the skills provided by these workers. But it's not just high skilled workers either. To sort of make it personal for a lot of people, the government did end the J1 visa for all pairs, which is, a temporary visa for somebody to come in from abroad to live in your home and to take care of your children. And, this isn't a huge visa. It's not used by a huge number of people, but it is overwhelmingly used by higher skilled women, who are mothers, who have jobs and careers. And this provides a great opportunity for them to both be mothers as well as to work. And the government has essentially ended this program. So, if my goal, and it's not my goal, but if my goal were to basically keep a lot of high skilled American women out of the labor force, this would be one way to do it. One of the many policies that one would pursue in order to do that. Now, the government has also introduced in early October a series of regulations that would raise the wages for H-1B workers. And H-1B workers are high-skilled temporary workers in specialty occupations. And the goal of raising these wages is to essentially keep most of them, as many of them as possible, out of the United States, and a fruitless attempt to raise wages for American workers in occupations where wages are already increasing. Now, what's interesting is this regulation, they mess up a lot of the data when they calculate it. They compare different data sets that are incomparable. So they'll take a look at like how much people make in computer occupations in one survey, which is collected in a whole different way from another survey, but then they'll take that wage and apply it to a different survey, and then they'll apply that to a different survey to try to get their magical number of what the wage should be. And as we know from governments messing around with wages and prices, this is all going to end up in a giant mess. So what we basically see is if the government is able to get this regulation through in time, which it seems like they will be able to, it will massively decrease the number of skilled immigrants who are able to come to the United States and force a lot of H-1B workers who are here currently to either change jobs or in some cases to have to leave the country. And the H-1B visa is for most people who get an employment-based green card, sort of one of their early steps in the United States to be able to live and work permanently. And sort of finally and most depressingly, the number of green cards that are being issued by the Trump administration in the second half of 2020. And these are green cards issued to people who are abroad. So I'm not talking about people who are already in the United States and get their green cards. This isn't much affected by that. But if you're abroad and you're waiting for your green card, in the second half of 2020, the number issued dropped by 92%, which is the single largest decline in such a short period of time that we've seen in American history. It is greater than the decline after the government closed its open borders policy with Europe in the 1920s. It's greater than the decline that we saw at the beginning of the Great Depression. It's greater than the decline that we saw at the beginning of World War II or World War I, even. So this is sort of a massive decline. And the government, the Trump administration, when they announced this, they said they were doing it for two reasons. The first reason that they didn't emphasize much was due to COVID, to try to stop the spread of disease internationally. But the second reason and the main reason is to try to protect the American labor market, to try to keep jobs for Americans in this sort of misguided, economically illiterate attempt to prevent job losses caused by the virus. So what I suspect is if President Trump gets reelected, he will keep these bans in place for as long as he possibly can, because it ticks a lot of boxes that he wants to achieve, cutting legal immigration. And unfortunately, since the ruling in the case Trump v. Hawaii in 2018, we don't see many practical limits legally as the law currently stands for the president on his ability to cut legal immigration. So we're really in this sort of very worrisome environment with a very few legal checks on what the administration can do in terms of issuing visas to people who are abroad. As much as I complain about immigration law and how terrible it is and restrictive it is, and how much it hurts America's national interests, immigrants, Americans, everybody, um, the only thing worse than that is this sort of unilateral control in the office of the president to cut immigration wherever he wants for whatever reason he wants. And that's the legal situation that we are in now. So I worry for the future that the debate will be about immigration instead of about Congress and changing the law and operating, in a representative democracy where we debate things in Congress and pass laws, that we're going to a situation where it's basically the president issuing orders with very little oversight. So that's sort of a broader institutional complaint. It's not entirely confined to immigration. It affects trade and lots of other areas. But in immigration, I think, is the area where you can point to the president's authority being very wide and, unfortunately, according to many recent court rulings, without any obvious limits.
When prior to the DACA program, I discovered my lack of immigration status upon graduating from high school. That was back in 2007. And thanks to the DACA program, I've been able to continue my advocacy efforts, as well as returning to school and obtaining a master's degree, which is kind of like the story that we see across the board from 700,000 beneficiaries of this program. For the past number of years, DACA recipients have been contributing to the United States, not just through their taxes and their labor, but have been some of the most committed individuals to ensuring that they represent what is best of America, their families, their culture, and what they can become if they're given a chance to adjust their immigration status. Unfortunately, what we've seen from this administration has been nothing short of continued attacks on the DACA program. This past July, we saw a victory at the Supreme Court that allowed the DACA program to remain. But unfortunately, what we've seen now is that the administration has all intents of continuing to shrink the program to make it even harder for people to access it. As we're speaking right now, some of you may be familiar with the fact that the administration, through the Department of Homeland Security and ultimately through USCIS, has issued guidance to cut the program in half, basically rendering a benefit that is now active for only 1 year instead of 2 years, as it originally was stated, which means that the increase in fees, $495, will now be doubled, which is a significant barrier for a lot of beneficiaries, especially in rural communities, and especially those who are currently navigating the higher education system as I once was. I say all this to kind of paint the backdrop that what we've seen thus far is this relentless attack against this particular community, short of 1 million individuals, but also no indication that there is any credible plan that wouldn't be tied to enforcement by the Trump administration or by the Republican Party thus far. We have seen a majority of, we've seen a variety of different bills come and go, but none have essentially been given the green light to kind of circumvent a lot of the roadblocks that we've seen, not just from the administration over in the executive at the White House, but also in the Senate, where Mitch McConnell has not given hearing to some of the other pieces of legislation, such as the Dream and Promise Act. That is obviously particularly concerning for myself and also for a lot of people who have worked on this issue for a variety of different issues. For a variety of different periods of time. And I think what the panorama looks ahead for the DACA program specifically, at least in my view, is under a second term of the Trump administration, is the potential repeal of the program, with the threat that if the country or the Democratic Party does not accept higher immigration restrictions, that this program will ultimately go away, and the individuals currently benefiting under it could be subjected to deportation. Similarly, we may see perhaps other proposals that include baking in the DACA program into whatever plans, nefarious or otherwise, the administration may have to try to pass it through Congress and try to essentially use it as a bargaining chip for any other number of policy issues that they may try to add to their policy agenda during a second term. Again, and I cannot overstate this enough, because it feels that every time that the administration remotely says anything that is digestible on immigration, it tends to mean that people try to essentially turn the other way and figure out whether or not the president is going to flip on the issue, or if they're going to be kind to immigrants. And what we've seen for the past 4 years is anything but. There's really not been any sort of indication, and I myself, as a beneficiary of this program, have absolutely no hope that this president or his advisors or his allies in Congress will try to do anything but continue to attack the DACA program. Joe Biden has essentially done a couple of things over the past number of months, and even so weeks, that indicate a much more different approach than the one that the Trump administration would take under a second term. Number one is essentially the continuation of the DACA program, which to a lot of people sounds like a good thing. However, it does not, take us out of the fact that there are, or there would be likely additional legal challenges by means of other attorney generals or potentially red states to attack the program or continue to attack the program. And I think that this is worth noting, the fact that the Obama and the Biden administration back, from 2008 to 2012 really had a very tragic record and destructive record in immigration when it comes to deportations. And it was somewhat refreshing seeing the former vice president acknowledging, that record and trying to apologize for it. Only time will tell what a Biden administration will ultimately end up doing. But the contrast couldn't be clearer, given that it was, under the Obama administration in 2012 that the DACA program was, conjured into existence. So I think that we're obviously at a crossroads when it comes to this issue.